Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two more creepy cases of people disappearing. The first one is just outright disturbing, and the second one is one of the most infamous cases in all of history. And to this day, both cases remain officially unsolved. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In the early afternoon of July 5th, 1996, just after the big lunch rush, the phone rang at the Eatco pizzeria on the south side of Chicago, as it typically did most of the day. After 2 o'clock though, things quieted down for a while before Eatco entered dinner time. When the phone rang around this time of the afternoon, the owner, Thompson, knew there would usually be a familiar voice on the other line to greet him. Sure enough, it was his father, Herman. Herman knew that his son would likely have a moment to catch his breath in the afternoon, and that was the perfect time to pester him about visiting Philadelphia. Despite the distance between them, Everett was close with his parents. Years earlier, he left Philly to work in the steel mills in Chicago, and after meeting and marrying his wife Lydia, he left the steel mills and opened up the Eatco pizzeria. Although he had no previous restaurant experience, with Lydia's support, Everett knew he had to give it a shot. Cooking was his top passion, and he knew he was good enough to make a career out of it. By owning his own restaurant, he was living a life he only dreamed about, and he got to share it with the love of his life and their children, 11-year-old Everett Jr. and 8-year-old Andrew. The two boys were actually the reason for Herman's phone call. It had been too long since he had seen the grandkids, so a trip to Philadelphia was long overdue. At the same time, owning a restaurant was demanding work, so it wasn't easy to take time off. But just like every other time Herman would call, Everett promised his father he'd bring them for a visit just as soon as he could. While the two talked on the phone, the other phone line started ringing, and Everett glanced at the caller ID and saw his home phone number on the display. He told Herman to hang on a second and then switched over to the other line, and then he heard Lydia's voice, and she sounded frantic. The words she was saying were almost surreal, and Everett had to fight the urge to ask her to repeat them. Her brother Kenneth had an axe and was threatening to kill Lydia and the kids. Before Kenneth could get within swinging distance of the boys, Lydia grabbed them and took them to the bedroom, where she locked the door and called Everett. He then told her to stay where she was and not open the door under any circumstances. Then, switching back to the line with Herman, Everett told him that Lydia was in trouble and he had to go. He then turned to the restaurant manager and said the same, and around 3 o'clock, Everett hurried out the door and jumped into his van to race home. Surprisingly, this was like deja vu. Not 2 days earlier, Lydia called police for the exact same thing, and Everett had to leave the restaurant in a hurry then too. Her brother Kenneth, who was 41 years old at the time, was prone to angry outbursts and unhinged behavior, which had him in and out of prison most of his life for a variety of violent crimes. And ever since Kenneth had been released from prison the most recent time, he had been nothing but trouble for the family. Lydia also inherited the house they were living in on the south side of Chicago when her mother died. During that time, Kenneth was locked up, but the house was intended to be split 3 ways between Lydia, Kenneth, and one other sibling. With each of them owning a third of the house, Kenneth moved in when he was paroled, and there was nothing Lydia could do about it. A couple of hours later, at 5 o'clock, Everett's employees saw his van pull back in its designated parking spot, relieved that he had made it back just in time for things to get busy. They figured whatever was wrong earlier had been resolved, but when the driver's side door opened, it wasn't Everett who got out of the van. Instead, it was a tall, lanky man in his early 40s they immediately recognized as Kenneth. As he walked in, he was approached by the manager, and before the manager could say anything, his attention was drawn to shoes Kenneth was wearing. The shoes themselves were nice enough, but it wasn't the style that caught the manager's eye. It was how well these sterile white sneakers contrasted with the streaks of blood on them. When the manager shifted his focus away from the shoes, he asked Kenneth where Everett was, and according to Kenneth, Everett was in a car accident on the way to get Lydia and was arrested at the scene for reasons Kenneth struggled to specify. It was an odd interaction, but after grabbing a takeout order, Kenneth left the store and drove away in the van. As days passed, Everett failed to show up for work, and no one could get a hold of anyone in the family, and Herman was especially bothered by his inability to get in contact with Everett with his phone calls. Without fail, any other day, Herman would find him at the restaurant whenever he called, but employees told Everett's father they hadn't seen him since he rushed out the door on July 5th. After nearly 2 weeks without hearing from his son, Herman called the Chicago police and requested a welfare check on the Thompsons' home. When police officers arrived, it was Kenneth who answered the door. The officers explained the reason for their visit, and Kenneth was quick to explain it away. On a whim, Kenneth said, Everett decided to load up the family in the van and take an unplanned trip to Philadelphia. Police then asked if they could enter the home and take a look around to be sure, and Kenneth obliged, but a tour of each room revealed nothing out of the ordinary, so the officers thanked Kenneth and left the house. Surprisingly, despite Kenneth's claim that the Thompsons took the van to go to Philly, the van was parked at the house when police arrived, and they didn't even notice. Then, in the days after the Thompsons seemingly disappeared, police even pulled Kenneth over for a traffic violation while driving the family's van. Unfortunately, they never connected the dots between his original story and the record they had of Kenneth being in possession of the van. Before the month ended with no further word from the Thompsons, Everett's parents drove from Philadelphia to Chicago to find out what was going on for themselves. As they pulled into the area, they went straight to the Eat Co, where they expected Everett to be. They then parked and entered the restaurant, where they spoke to the manager and learned about Kenneth having the van and his bloody shoes. That was all Everett's parents needed to hear, and they went straight to the police and begged them to investigate. This time, when police started to investigate a little more closely, they quickly found that none of what they already knew made sense. This was when they realized the alarming oversight involving Kenneth's original story in the van, but there was nothing they could do about it by then because the van was gone. One of the first things they did was check police reports from July 5th to confirm that Everett was involved in an automobile accident and arrested as a result, but no record of that existed. Kenneth's phony story and the reported blood on his shoes were enough probable cause to secure a warrant, but when police showed up at the Thompsons' home to serve it, they could barely believe what they saw. The whole interior of the house had been completely gutted. The confused police were then approached by the equally confused new owners of the house who were having it remodeled. This meant that if there was any physical evidence that pointed to foul play in the disappearance of the Thompsons, it was now in a landfill somewhere. The next best thing police could do was review the report of the house inspection conducted before the sale. In it, the inspector noted that the kitchen floor had been ripped out with the subfloor exposed as if someone was preparing it for a new floor. This, by the way, was before the new owners came in and started tearing the place apart. There was also a mention of a toilet and bathtub that were painted red. However, the officers who responded to Lydia's 911 call 2 days prior were emphatic in their denial that any of the bathrooms had a red toilet or bathtub when they were there. If there had been, that would have stuck out beyond anything else they witnessed during their look around. When police finally tracked down and arrested Kenneth and brought him in for questioning, they found out that the van was sold to a scrapyard and crushed immediately afterwards, so any evidence that might have been in there was long gone too. This also brought the next question of how Kenneth sold the van and the house, since they were both in Lydia's name, and the answer was simple. Kenneth forged her signature. This was already a for sure conviction, but police had two options: arrest him now and hope to secure a murder charge before he was released, or don't arrest him and see what he does next to turn up any leads. They opted for the latter and uncovered some of the strongest evidence in the case against Kenneth as a result. After he sold the house, Kenneth bought a trailer home in, of all places, Gary, Indiana, and a year after the Thompsons vanished, the FBI and police secured a warrant to search it. Investigators then searched the trailer and Kenneth's belongings, and they also brought in cadaver dogs to see if they could find something police officers couldn't. Among the items they uncovered in the trailer was a child's sock and a pair of shorts, both heavily stained with blood. Despite the find though, police weren't able to tie the items to the Thompsons. Afterward, more time would pass without answers, and Kenneth continued to garner the attention of police, both as a top suspect and a habitual offender. He was arrested in November 1997 for a probation violation for failing to register as an offender, and in the following months he was charged with forgery after he was caught trying to cash another $13,000 check using Lydia's forged signature. When state prosecutors met up with the media, they brought up that Kenneth was the top suspect in the Thompson family disappearance, which was news that hadn't been released to the public yet. It seemed like things were heating up in the Thompson family saga, but just days later, none of it mattered. Kenneth was found dead on a late December morning. He was the only one in the cell, and it wasn't an accident. So, the valuable information of the whereabouts of the Thompsons died with him. Almost 30 years later, Everett Sr., Lydia, Everett Jr., and Andrew are still considered missing persons. Alcatraz is one of, if not the most famous prison on Earth. If you're from North America, I probably didn't even need to tell you it was a prison, but for those who aren't familiar, almost exactly 2 kilometers from shore, Alcatraz is a small, cold, lonely island in the San Francisco Bay. This little island would eventually go on to house one of the most isolated and supposedly inescapable prisons on Earth. The first permanent structure on the island was almost built under Mexican ownership in 1846 with the Mexican government intent on installing a lighthouse. Later on, as part of the new state of California and during the California Gold Rush, the US Army set about turning the island into a fortress. By 1861, the same year the American Civil War began, it also became a prison, an armory, and a training base. The harsh currents, cold water, and fortifications made it ideal for keeping prisoners in and everyone else out. Then, in 1868, the island would officially be designated a military prison as its main function. POWs from the Spanish-American War would follow in 1898 and more civilian prisoners in 1906, with the San Francisco earthquake compromising the structure or security of several mainland prisons. Between 1909 and 1912, the prison's main building would be constructed, and sometime between then and 1915 earned the island its common nickname, the Rock. In 1933, the island was officially transferred to the Bureau of Prisons, who designated it a federal prison in the next year. Its new purpose would be to house people too dangerous to hold elsewhere, and especially people with a history of escape attempts or violence during incarceration. Afterward, everyone from mob bosses, bank robbers, murderers, and famous and eccentric prisoners would pass through the island, but it would only actually serve as a civilian prison for just 29 years. And during that time, it would also be said that no one had ever escaped, but that depends a bit on how you define escape. During the prison's lifespan, 36 men made 14 different attempts to escape. A few lasted seconds, some made it multiple days, but there's one that stands far and above the rest. It's now known as the escape from Alcatraz, and it's maybe the most infamous prison escape in all of history. In December of 1961, 4 men, including Frank Morris, brothers John and Clarence Anglin, and Alan West, were housed in adjacent cells. They lived, worked, and dreamed together, looking out over the water in brief glimpses whenever a prison job brought them somewhere where they could see, because the cells didn't have any windows otherwise. The prison was also as fortified as the cells were isolated. Each cell was made of hardened, cut-resistant bars, there were guard patrols around the clock, and the island was surrounded by freezing water for kilometers on all sides. Even the shape of the prison, with tall retaining walls, guard towers, and choke points like stairwells, made it easier for guards to keep track of movement. Fortunately, Frank was paying careful attention to all of this. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1926, Frank was a very intelligent man and probably wouldn't have found himself in Alcatraz if not for losing his parents at 11 years old. His life spiraled, first into theft, then drugs, armed robbery, and after an escape from prison in Louisiana, he found himself transferred to Alcatraz. Any escape attempt wasn't going to work out alone though. As smart as he may have been, Frank Morris was only one person, and the work that needed doing would have taken him years to do alone. This is where he got the help of John and Clarence Anglin. The brothers were 2 out of over a dozen siblings from Georgia, born a year apart in 1930 and 1931. Their parents were seasonal farmhands who moved up and down the eastern half of the United States to follow their work. But the brothers built a history of breaking into businesses after hours and one time robbed a bank with a toy gun. These would continue to escalate until they were finally arrested, and then once in the prison system, multiple attempts to escape the Atlanta penitentiary got John transferred to Alcatraz in October 1960 and his brother Clarence the next year, January of 1961. But it was actually the 4th man, Alan West, who came up with the idea that set everything in motion. Alan was born in New York in 1929 and had been arrested over a dozen times before a car theft in 1955 sent him to the Atlanta penitentiary and then to Florida State Prison. Trying to escape from the state prison eventually landed him on Alcatraz in 1957, several years before the other men. During his time at the prison, Alan occasionally found himself working up on the roof of the main building where he noticed the various drains and ventilation shafts, and it gave him an idea. One day, back in his cell, he told the brothers and Frank about it and how it might be just the opportunity they were looking for. The men knew quite a few people had tried to escape before them, and it all failed. Most had been captured, but some had even been shot and killed, so they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. However, those previous failures also had lessons to teach. Over the next 6 months, the men had their work cut out for them, and everything had to be done as stealthily as possible. Prisoners were subject to a dozen searches a day, but even still, each managed to smuggle small items into their cells. Like, for example, broken saw blades from the workshop, metal spoons, and the motor of a broken vacuum cleaner, which they turned into an improvised drill. With these items, the men began slowly drilling a ring of holes around the edges of the air vents underneath each of their sinks. The bars may have been upgraded in the 1930s, but the island's concrete had been subject to years of exposure to salt water and had begun to weaken. They then used fake painted cardboard that matched the color of the cell walls to conceal their work during the day, and the prison's music hour offered them a brief moment of time to dig without the guards hearing them. Frank would play his accordion as well to add extra noise, and bit by bit, the 4 men made the holes wide enough to crawl through. Once on the other side, the men found themselves in an old utility hallway full of vents and pipes, as well as access to the unused top floor of the prison. Since no one was able to get up there, they then had the entire floor of the building without any guards to worry about to use as a workshop. Next, to conceal the time they spent in their workshop, the men needed to be in 2 places at once. So mixing toilet paper with soap, toothpaste, and concrete dust, the men created 4 paper mache heads. Then with paint from the workshop and smuggled hair clippings from the barber's floor, the men made heads convincing enough that a passing guard in the night with a flashlight wouldn't be able to spot the difference. Then on top of that, extra sets of clothing stuffed under the blankets further filled out the illusion. This time and secrecy allowed them to begin the real work of their plan. Frank had received several popular mechanics and Sports Illustrated magazines during their incarceration, and inside these he found designs for a life preserver vest, a homemade inflatable boat, and information about harbor buoys and what they signify. Then for months, the men collected materials in their hidden workshop. Some they stole from around the prison, and others were traded, donated, or stolen from other prisoners, but was somewhere secret to actually keep all of it, the guards had no idea. They even built a boat out of over 50 raincoats by stitching them together and then using the heat from steam pipes to cure liquid plastic epoxy. The men also made wooden paddles and even a periscope for whoever was on lookout duty to keep an eye on the guards in the evening. Finally, on the 11th of June, 1962, it was time. That night, the men set up their dummies and made their way into the back corridor, but there was a problem. In the days prior, the vent hole in Alan's cell was starting to collapse under its own weight, so he'd smuggled in some concrete to rebuild portions of the hole. That concrete had hardened faster than he expected and stuck his vent in place. The others tried to help him re-drill the holes, but soon realized they were running out of time and risking discovery by digging in the night. In the end, the three men left Alan behind as he continued to try to widen the opening. They then made their way into their workshop and then climbed a series of pipes up 9 meters or 30 feet to the ceiling, where a series of large fans circulated air into the spaces at the top of the building. Previously, the men had opened one of the fans and put it back in place with a temporary bolt made of soap so they could break it when they needed to. They then climbed out onto the roof and descended down a kitchen pipe, scaled 2 barbed wire fences, and made their way to the power station near the northwestern tip of the island. The power station had a guard hut next to it where a single man was posted, but unlike other parts of the island, it wasn't a tower. This meant that the power plant building and adjoining guard barracks blocked the guards' view of the ocean. And so, sometime that night, Frank, John, and Clarence slipped into the water. The boat they'd built was triangular and about 6 by 14 feet, or 2.8 by 4.3 meters. The main issue with it was that it had no proper air nozzle, so one of the 3 men had to use a concertina stolen from another prisoner, which is a kind of miniature accordion, to constantly inflate it. Beyond that, without a rigid frame or a way to keep the pressure high, the raft would have wobbled and bent in the waves of San Francisco Harbor. Either way, their plan was to paddle out to Angel Island, where they could steal clothing and a car from a campsite in the night and make their way to freedom. Alan did eventually make it out of his cell, only to find the men had already left. So, defeated, he returned to his bed before dawn. In the morning, a guard came around to do the morning count, and when Frank didn't respond, he reached the bars and rocked the false head, which immediately fell out of bed and broke its nose on the ground. Immediately, the alarm was raised, and Alcatraz went into lockdown as a 10-day search by the U.S. Coast Guard, San Francisco Police Department, U.S. Army, and others began. 3 days later, on the 14th, a Coast Guard found a wooden paddle floating off the shore of Angel Island, as well as a wallet belonging to one of the brothers. It had family photographs, names, addresses, and other personal documents inside, something clearly important to them, which they wouldn't have let go easily. Then, on the 21st, torn shreds of raincoat were found on the coast near the Golden Gate Bridge, and the next day, one of the men's deflated life jackets floated back to Alcatraz. All of these items had been rolling back and forth for days and weeks in the tide. On the 17th of July, over a month after the escape, a Norwegian freighter spotted a body in the water 28 kilometers offshore and suspected it to be one of the men, although it was never picked up and confirmed. It was also during this confused aftermath that Alan was discovered to have been involved and offered his full assistance in exchange for not being prosecuted. He then showed authorities everything they had done and explained the plan in detail, but it wasn't clear that it had gone as hoped. The plan had been to steal a car and clothing upon reaching the shore, but no thefts were reported, and beyond that, the men have never truly been confirmed to have been seen again. For many years afterward, the search continued, and public speculation and tips to the FBI numbered in the hundreds, ranging from nothing at all to the truly unbelievable. Like, for example, another prisoner at Alcatraz, Clarence Carnes, allegedly received a letter with the coded phrase "gone fishing," meaning they made it from Frank, but was never able to produce the letter or evidence of it. Similarly, the brothers' families claimed to have received letters from the brothers on holidays. Apparently, these letters were always without postage, dates, or any way to verify where they came from or if they had been from previous years. And even more than that, after 3 years, the letters stopped abruptly. Many of their relatives and friends also claimed to have had personal contact with them at various points, and that 2 strange individuals attended both parents' funerals, one pair of men and another pair of tall women in heavy makeup. Similarly, many private investigators and professionals hired by the brothers' family have supposedly authenticated evidence of the brothers, no matter how blurry or inconclusive it was deemed to be. Other reports came in from all over the country and even from South America, placing Frank and the brothers in nearly every state, despite the men having no money to their names for travel and, most of all, a long history of being caught for crimes in the past. Yet, no crimes are ever known to be committed by the men ever again. In the 1990s, a friend of the brothers claimed to have met with the brothers in 1975 by random chance in Rio de Janeiro and took a photograph of the men on their farm. Then in 1993, a man named John Leon Kelly confessed on his deathbed to having killed the men after picking them up and taking them to Seattle, but unfortunately no bodies were found where he claimed to have buried them and so on. There's simply no way that all of these stories could be true at the same time, and in spite of the FBI's investigation following up on hundreds of claims, including sending a team to Brazil decades before the Friends claims, not one lead ever yielded anything. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter, reportedly from one of the brothers, offering to turn himself in exchange for cancer treatment. But the U.S. Marshal, who was still assigned to investigate them to this day, confirmed the handwriting did not match. So the question is, were they really successful? In trying to explain this, many people have pointed to the conditions of the water around the island. Each night, the current in San Francisco Bay can reach 5 or 6 knots, supposedly twice the average speed someone paddling can sustain long term. Further still, the water temperature on that night was a hypothermically cold 12 degrees Celsius or 54 Fahrenheit. Even on a calm, perfect day, it would have taken the men half an hour to paddle from Alcatraz to shore, as many people have done as part of triathlons or swimming competitions. In addition, these are always held during slack tide when the bay is calm, for safety reasons. But although unlikely, it's not impossible. Investigations done in 2014 by the Dutch Delft University revealed a brief period of time starting at 11:30 that night when the tide may have helped men reach land north of the Golden Gate Bridge. Alternatively, if the men had realized the tide was trying to help pull them out under the Golden Gate Bridge instead of fighting it to reach Angel Island, they could have used it. However, at the same time in the night, with only distant pinpricks of light to orient themselves, it's doubtful the men would have been able to notice this until they'd already spent a significant amount of time paddling in the wrong direction, wasting energy and getting colder. In fact, just months later, on the 16th of December, a man named John Paul Scott built a flotation device of his own out of rubber gloves and attempted to swim to shore. He was later found washed up under the Golden Gate Bridge on the south end, unconscious and near death from hypothermia. Had he not received hospital care shortly after being swept, he would have died, but at the same time, he did make it to land. In the end, their escape would be the final nail in the coffin for Alcatraz. The island's infrastructure was already crumbling, and the operation cost was over 3 times higher per capita than the average US prison. So, on the 21st of March, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy closed Alcatraz prison for good. The last part of the story is that Alan West eventually served his sentence and was released, only to reoffend 1 year later in 1967 and once again be sentenced to prison. In 1972, he would stab another inmate to death and received a life sentence, and he would eventually die in prison. So, what do you think happened? Do you think they happened to make the one and only successful escape from Alcatraz, or do you think they got lost in the freezing water before ever making it to land? Let me know down in the comments what you think happened. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.